Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this audio blog space or this video blog space if you're watching for the reading of my piece, Bobbing at the Surface and Grasping Onto Ego. Now, first, why do we call this space Milk and Honey Meditation? Well, Canaan was the land of milk and honey, and it was the land that God promised to the Israelites after they were released from captivity or their oppression. But before arriving to the land, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness and in the desert for 40 years. And I think that life can sometimes feel like wandering or searching or striving as we're on our individual journeys. And so this blog is intended to help support you and to nourish you while you're on your journey. It's all about how to discover the beauty and the fullness and the holistic design of our lives. So both the pain and the pleasure, highs and the lows, and wins and losses. And it's how to hold those things. So the milk and the honey. And so now, without further ado, let's get into the piece, Bobbing at the Surface and Grasping Onto Ego. People find comfort in bobbing at the surface. These were the words spoken to me by one of my spiritual mentors. Heartbroken over a relationship that felt like it was coming to an end, I explained to her how painful it was. And since then, honestly, her words have had a resounding impact on my life, even though at the time I had no idea of the journey that I would go on because of her words. Now I'm going to pause for a second and zoom out for a moment just to say that this piece took me such a long time to produce. Such a long time. And I had trouble finding the words to describing this feeling of hopelessness and the strange feeling, but yet common experience. I think the cultural narrative that relationships should stay the same in order to last is really to blame for my trouble in writing this piece. And that's because relationships are dynamic and ever evolving, and they're always taking different forms. And yet, in our culture, we treat them as if they should remain static and stay the same forever. And honestly, I'm bothered by how unrealistic this is, because for this to be true, it would mean that as human beings, we would have to stay in the same place from like childhood to late adulthood to death. We would have to stay the same. And what's more frustrating is that this notion causes us to stay in places too long or to forcibly manipulate relationships into forms that don't serve either the individual or the relationship. But let's back up for a moment to clarify how I got here. So, chapter 1, how it started. It started in my 20s, and in my 20s, I held so tightly onto my expectations for myself and for others. I used sacrifice syndrome to force myself into work that I didn't love. I forced myself to push past burnout because I was supposed to. And I tried to force commitment on men who weren't ready to be in relationships, creating nothing but sad and soppy situationships. In addition, I forced myself to remain in friendships that didn't deeply serve me. Okay, so all this force, cue the rage, the hurtful words, and the emotionally immature behaviors. Cue it all. So that was my 20s. And we often use our agency as human beings to grasp onto desired outcomes. We grasp onto what we want and the way we want things to be so much that anything that deviates from what we want causes us suffering. Now, grasping, of course, means to hold firmly or to grip tightly. In Buddhism, it is associated with attachment or clinging. So grasping for the sake of this piece, is a state of mind. Chapter 2, Journey to Transformation. Okay, so fast forward later on in my adult life, my states of grasping took on different forms. The grasping showed up later as clinging to my positive desires for others. Or, in other words, it evolved into me wanting so badly for the people around me to grow, or wanting to give something to another person for the purpose of self-help, unsolicited most of the time. The problem with this kind of well-intended thoughtfulness or thoughtful grasping is that it can become forceful, and it doesn't give the other person much room to exist as they are. Clinging to our positive desires for people can be just as egoic, and ultimately, when acted out, has the potential to be harmful. Chapter 3, Exhibit A. It's a clear example of how grasping, when done with positive intentions, can be harmful. Now, in the beginning, I shared that some time ago, I started realizing that me and someone very close to me were no longer growing together. That I felt like I was evolving and that I had reached a stage in my evolution where I had become empowered to express my emotional needs and advocate for myself in relationships. But unfortunately, with this person, the expression of my needs wasn't met with the acceptance that I wanted. My boundaries were challenged, and it was actually starting to cause real tension between us. And this hurt, and it made me worry. And so aside from my boundaries being pushed, I was beginning to feel stuck because I wanted so badly for this person, let's just call them Jordan, to experience some of the same growth insights that I had experienced so we could be growing together. But because they had not arrived at this place yet, we found ourselves tangled up in difficult interactions often. And we were both starting to feel unheard and unseen. And now, at first, I tried to minimize the situation because of how much I cared for Jordan. But then I started having trouble sleeping once the fear, anger, and anxiety started to swell in me so much that I just couldn't ignore it. So I knew I had to do something. Chapter 4, An Awakening. Now, this is where the discussion with my spiritual mentor re-enters. And so I spoke to my mentor about my relationship with Jordan. People find comfort in bobbing at the surface, she told me. Now, because I could not get her words out of my head, I decided that I had to bring it into my meditation space. And so one day, I introduced the issue during centering prayer. And in centering prayer, I started by focusing on my mentor's words. I sat in the silence for 20 minutes with these words. Now, centering prayer, if you're not familiar, is a method of silent prayer and meditation used within the Christian contemplative tradition. And similar to meditation, the time is silent, and we try to release any thoughts that may and will come up during the time. A word is then chosen to set the intention and introduced in order to consent to God's presence and action within. And usually the word is positive, and it's one that will help to refocus our attention. And so that way, when thoughts or distractions arise, we can gently release them by reintroducing the chosen word to ground in the open space that exists within the silence. And so it's a way of being with God more intimately. Instead of praying outwardly, or grasping onto our desires in prayer and using words to direct our needs to God, we allow the Holy Spirit to direct us and fill the space. Father Richard Rohr says, contemplative prayer is a form of unveiling because it reveals what is going on beneath the polished and busy surfaces of our minds, our hearts, and our bodies. And when we finally get still enough, contemplation can live within us in pure, open moments of right here, right now. I just love that quote. And so, as a result of my centering prayer practices over the course of a few days, I actually started gaining more insight that led me to then uncover a new dimension of self-evolution. And my mentor's words just started to fit right into place. It was as if the Spirit was adding more color to a black and white canvas that was given to me. Chapter 5, Deep Water Swimming. The added color led to a revelation that has completely changed my life. During centering prayer, I saw an image of myself swimming in deep waters. Then I swam to the surface where I could see a figure of a person. I swam towards the figure and then began encouraging them to join me in deep water, as if to say, come this way. The figure was non-responsive, so I began joyfully pulling them down to the place where I was swimming. But the figure was resistant, and zooming out from the image, it was very clear that although I was innocently and gently pulling them, I was still pulling them against their will. And my pulling wasn't violent, but more importantly, it was unwanted. And then suddenly, almost like as if a pause happened, I heard the words, "You can't just yank others down deep with you, because if they're not ready, they'll drown." And then the 20 minutes of silent prayer ended, and I was, of course, absolutely amazed. Now, I'll pause to acknowledge how fabricated this may sound to some people. I'll also remind us that faith doesn't fit within reason, and this is why it's called faith and not logic, right? Because it's spiritual. So we don't always have to have an explanation. Instead, we can just surrender ourselves to a force that is greater than ourselves. And we can allow all the parts of us to be carried into the impossible, unimaginable, and unthinkable interstices of life. Okay, so zoom back in. This is where it all started to come together for me. Because I was able to swim deeper in my life. I wanted everyone close to me to leave the surface level waters for a more awakened inner life. And I was beginning to move deeper into my emotions, deeper towards my sense of self, deeper into heavier emotional experiences, and deeper into my conscience with the newfound ability to make the subconscious conscious. And y'all, it felt good. It felt good because this growth yielded new insights and life-changing self-discoveries. And so it was like, I want this for everybody in my life. I wanted it truly for everybody. Now, chapter 6. Here enters the problem. I Me, I am the problem in this case, right? So the problem is not created by our desires for others to change and grow. The problem begins when the grasping does, because grasping, remember, is egoic even when it's upheld by positive intentions and acted out innocently. Grasping in this way has honestly just created so many issues in so many of my relationships in the past, not just with Jordan. It's crept into my relationship with family members, with close friends, romantic partners, and even with colleagues at work. And that's because I just was in this terrible habit or place of clinging to my expectations for others and then clinging to my desires for others to move into the waters that I'm existing in. And of course, this doesn't work because inward change has to be self-determined. We cannot control the lives of others. And to illustrate this, I'm going to bring in spiritual writer Layla Delia, who's also a beloved spiritual teacher of mine. And she talks about this using what I think is a very relatable nature analogy. She says, human relationships are like root systems and branches of trees. They're extensions of us. When we care for trees, we have to prune the dead limbs and leaves in order to make space for the appropriate environment for growth, fruitfulness, and thriving. She says that we can notice the level of care and intention and soulful grooming that makes way for greater growth and development. And this is how we can learn to feel better after being in certain gardens and around certain people. Because again, we reflect nature in the same way. So we can ask ourselves these questions. These are wonderful questions that I think she gives to us. She says, what isn't working or growing? What needs to be trimmed away or dug up from the roots? And what is negatively affecting the whole and spreading like a virus? And that's from her book, Vibrate Higher Daily, which I encourage everyone to go out and get. It's wonderful. At this point, I've read it multiple times, and it's truly a gem. So to dive back in, I needed to dig up some of the things within myself from the root. And I needed, most importantly, to release Jordan's growth to Jordan and focus on the virus that was spreading inside of me. Now, silence and stillness is just such a gift, and the silence and stillness that we experience during meditation can help us to become aware of rotting roots like egoic motivations, witness them without judgment, and then create inner peace for ourselves. It can also help us to become aware of when our behavior is motivated by fear. Grasping or attachment is a fear-based behavior. And I love Thomas Keating's words that I have to mention here. He calls it the desire for security, affection, and control. And so I'm linking those things with fear here. So for some of us, this looks like overworking ourselves for fear that we may lose the approval of our colleagues, or overworking to maintain a certain level of influence at work. It could also look like saying yes when we should say no to receive affection from our friends or family. Or maybe for others, it may look like remaining in a romantic relationship because the thought of staying makes us feel more secure rather than the thought of starting over. Okay, so grasping for security, affection, and control is human. And trust me, I get it. The thought of releasing it sounds just oxymoronic completely, right? Okay, chapter 7. We interrupt this program to explain the science behind the sinkhole of fear. So we desire security, affection, and control because our brains are wired for both safety and belonging. And we learned this in polyvagal theory, which I just love. It's something that I use in my practice regularly. And it helps us to identify the multiple states of the nervous system, which is why I love it. Most people have heard about or know one part of the theory that we call fight, flight, freeze. All right, so that's familiar to most of us. But what this actually means is that our autonomic nervous system is mostly about safety and regulation. And so, unfortunately, though, when we talk about this theory, we forget about the regulation part. Okay, and so let's dive in. So these three states are hierarchical. So in our experiences, we move through them in a predictable order through states of connection, towards protection, and then back again. And so let's start with connection. And you can think of this as being at the top, or thinking of this being in a high vibrational space. So in the ventral vagal state, known as the parasympathetic nervous system, or the parasympathetic state, we are able to experience social connection, things like social communication, and our social engagement system is activated. So this is like our calm place. This is where we're at our best. We're at our highest selves, right? Where it's the place where we have the capacity to exist harmoniously with others. And it's also the place where we're able to think from a balanced and a centered space. Okay. Then move down a rung, and now we have the sympathetic nervous state, where our focus becomes mobilization. So, cue it. Here enters that part that most of y'all are familiar with, fight or flight, right? And this cognitive state we know is intended to keep us physically safe from threats of violence or danger. But we can also enter this state cognitively by grasping onto our desires and desired outcomes simply out of fear. And so desperate behaviors and patterns of thinking ensue at this point. Okay? And so parasympathetic, sympathetic, right? And now we're moving into, I would call it like the last rung or last tier. And this is more of a lower vibrational state. So this is called the dorsal vagal state. And it's where we see disconnection and collapse take place. Okay? And so most often, this is the place where we see or observe or even experience freezing or shutting down. And this is where we completely just sort of give in to hopelessness, despair, anguish, heavy feelings like this. And now, some people avoid actually feeling these feelings by just avoidantly giving up on a situation. So engagement and solutions-focused thinking cease, and they are no further applied in these kinds of lower states of being or existing, and no further effort is applied. And the unfortunate part here is that many people confuse this with healing. And unfortunately, it's not actually healing, because it's actually more like vaulting the situation and sending it into some deep, abysmal part of the brain determined to never revisit it again, right? But just because you send it into that abysmal part of the brain doesn't mean that it doesn't still exist, right? The pain is still there. It's just buried. And so one of the leading researchers in the field of psychology, I have to say, pause and say how much I just love this research from Dr. Stephen Porges. I'm going to quote him here, okay, because he says this, and I think it is very relatable when it comes to helping us to understand how we can connect and how we see ourselves within patterns of connection. He says, trauma compromises our ability to engage with others by replacing patterns of connection with patterns of protection. And now I would argue that fear exists in the same sort of way, but like at the opposite end of the spectrum as trauma. And although fear, we know, is a short-lasting emotion to a perceived threat, it also compromises our ability to engage with others healthily and from a centered place. And I think in doing so, fear can also replace patterns of connection with patterns of protection. And so I could talk about this all day long with y'all because I love brain science and I love this kind of psychological research. But I'll wrap it up here and say that in conclusion, polyvagal theory helps us to understand how we cope with and what is happening around us, whether we're experiencing states of calm or reacting to an actual threat to our safety, or just perceiving a threat to our safety. This theory really helps us to understand how we cope to what is going on around us. Okay. All right. That's enough brain science. Chapter 8, back to our regularly scheduled program. Okay. So when we experience fear-based thinking, now that we know where it comes from, it is our job to teach our brains that we're not actually in danger and that we're just experiencing a wave of emotion. Now, if we don't teach our brains this, then fear-based thoughts can lead us to make decisions from a place of desperation, which can lead to grasping. And when the mental state grasping takes over, we're likely to drive ourselves into a sinkhole, dragging the people around us down with us. Now, the sinkhole that I was dragging myself and Jordan into was indeed one that consisted of fear, but I discovered that it was actually one, too, that consisted of insecurity. So there was part of me that was grasping onto the outcomes that I wanted, right? And so that was fear-based. But then there was another part of me that was grasping for security by searching for Jordan's approval, which then kind of had this domino effect. It created anxiety and defensiveness, which then led to the disagreements and the debates that we ended up having. And so all of this stemmed from me feeling like I needed to defend my growth and my new insights in order to gain Jordan's approval. Now, since people pleasing is a disease that I have battled with my whole life, I was accustomed to seeking validation. And in moving out into the unfamiliar waters, it was hard for me to release the need for validation, right? That's where the seeking Jordan's approval came from. And so I actually was just kind of almost wired to crave and grasp on to the old and familiar feeling of receiving validation from the people that are closest to me. And I unfortunately failed to realize that my spiritual journey was my own. And the divine was interacting with me in ways that Jordan didn't have to understand, because this was my spiritual journey and my experiential knowledge of the divine, of God, that was generating spiritual growth within me. right? God was calling me into new waters and uncharted territories. And so it was never intended for me to seek the approval of anyone else. It was only intended for me to listen and to go, to head into those new waters or that uncharted territory. And so, in other words, seeking external validation is grasping. And I was grasping for security, affection, and control in that way. And so down into the sinkhole I went. Okay. Now, chapter 9, staying out of the sinkhole. How do we stay out of the sinkhole? Right? That's the question. So the opposite state of grasping, let's talk about the opposite now, is openness. And openness is something I'm not going to pretend like isn't easier said than done. But if you can practice the art of remaining open, you will learn the art of living and existing and being peacefully, right? Okay, and so to further this point, I'm going to introduce another quote from one of my beloved, I have to say, because she's so special to me, one of my beloved spiritual teachers, Tia Norman, who is the leader of the Awakenings Church in Houston. And she teaches us that there is one way that we can actually condition ourselves to this openness. And that one way is by using contemplative practices. She says, we can encounter states of resistance when we have to let go of things that are limiting us. Contemplative practices help us facilitate a daily letting go so that when the awareness from our actions arise in our lives and we decide that we want to make a shift or make changes, we can let go of the previous thing. We can just let the previous thing go, right? And so, end quote, and introduce the release into openness. I decided to let go and to just let go in faith, to just release. And I needed to do that because I had to believe that in doing so, divine love would carry Jordan in due time. And although I had no control over how much time it would take, I knew that it was better this way. So I chose to trust and release. And Gabrielle Bernstein calls this, she says, this is a universe of mathematical precision and order. I love that. I'll say that again. Gabrielle Bernstein says, this is a universe of mathematical precision and order. She says, you are initiated most often not by choice, but because a divine path has been set before you. And so, in her words, I surrendered and allowed myself to be carried down my divine path. Chapter 10. How it's going. How it's going. So I have determined in my letting go and my releasing into openness that I will not allow the pendulum to swing in the opposite direction when it comes to Jordan and I. So I haven't dropped the relationship altogether, but nor am I on the opposite end of grasping tightly to my desire for our relationship or my desires for our relationship to last, right? I'm not letting the pendulum swing one way or the other. Instead, I've just released it. Okay, I released it with love. I released it with grace and deep, deep compassion for Jordan. With no animosity, no love lost, not even a drop. Okay, so as of now, I've made no plans to determine what's next for us because it's actually not for me to determine at the moment. Instead, I'm focused on the call to trust and release. That's it. And as difficult as this whole situation was, to my surprise, the moment that I actually released it, I somehow felt better instantly. It was almost as if I was walking lighter. I was freer. I was just like walking differently because I was no longer living in the fear of the what ifs. Anytime the fear would come back in or like sneak its way back into my mental space, I just started using replacement thoughts instead. And so the like, what if we're not friends anymore? What if this happens? Or what if I never find, another person to enter into that space, right? I would reintroduce or replace those thoughts with replacement thoughts. So all the what ifs, what if you just released it, Aaron? What if you didn't hold on so tightly? Or what if you trusted in the divine love that saturates this universe rather than leaning into the desire for security, affection, and control? What if, right? So it's those replacement what ifs that I think are really companioning me right now. And so the pendulum remains in what I call the open space. And in this space, my palms are open to either giving and receiving or releasing. And most of all, in the open space, which I love saying it. I love feeling the energy of that, the open palms. In the open space, we're open to noticing what we might be grasping onto or following, or maybe we're following anger, maybe we're following fear. We're able to notice those things, right? And we're open to reflection to see if deep and hidden desires to please or move on too fast exist. We're open to receiving wisdom and direction from the Spirit as it comes up slowly and prayerfully. Okay? And so, next chapter, rewriting the cultural narrative about relationships. The common cultural narrative about relationships, y'all, is so constricting, right? Like the rules are just, for me at least, just way too dualistic and polarizing. And it's the reason, again, why this piece was so hard for me to write, why it took so many weeks for me to write this, y'all. I've been working on this piece for at least 2 months. And that's because I didn't know that I could integrate people into where I am instead of just, dismissing them from my life for good. Or again, on the opposite end or the opposite direction that the pendulum would swing in, instead of compromising my values and my spiritual growth, right? So I was almost thinking it had to be one or the other. You dismiss them, or you compromise your own values, your own spiritual growth. And there's just been nothing except the Holy Spirit, thankfully, that taught me how to release it and how to just exist in the open space, or how to just allow a relationship to evolve into a different iteration without a major upset or an estranged positioning. So, with that said, y'all, can we normalize something? Please. Can we normalize existing in the open space? Can we normalize not tossing a struggling relationship in the trash by angrily cutting people off? Can we normalize not clinging tightly to the current state of a relationship so tightly that our driving ego, our expectations, and our demands cuts the relationship's airflow off? Can we? Can we normalize struggling through with the people we love and giving them time to grow? Can we normalize hanging in there when someone is not growing at the same rate that we are, if it's not negatively impacting our mental state? And I'm saying all this, I'm chuckling to myself. And y'all know why? Because y'all know that millennials are so quick to cut a person off. And like I said in the beginning, I was prepared to end the relationship. I was ready to cut Jordan off. But truly, at this state, I don't believe that that's what the Spirit was leading me to do, is calling me to do. And I don't think that Spirit is always leading us to do this. Sometimes Spirit leads us to grow around the person, right? Like just in the same way that a plant can grow around a stake or grow up a wall. It's similar. And similarly, I also don't believe that the Holy Spirit calls us to remain in dysfunctional spaces to the point that we can no longer grow, or to the point where our mental well-being starts to sink from tension and toxicity. Okay? So, hear me when I say this. I do not think that anyone should remain in an unhealthy or an abusive relationship. Period. Okay? Both are toxic, and it's not at all what I'm talking about. It's just not the same thing. I'm talking about remaining in the life of someone who's a big supporter, who is aligned with you in most ways, or has demonstrated that they're willing to grow, and someone who loves and respects you and your essence in a deep way. Okay, that's what I'm talking about, right? As a side note, it's also important to note that the role that the person plays in your life, or the degree of closeness, matters naturally, right? Because relationship dynamics differ, okay? Now, let's go back to Layla Delia's words. Do you all remember her words about growing healthy relationships? Okay, so she adds to this by saying that healthy relationships don't just happen. They take work, nurturing, and pruning. She goes on to say, the right people help you grow and maintain a thriving and beautiful tree of life. That's how you'll know who they are. By knowing how to prune your own life, and by valuing and honoring the process, you grow more able to show up as a better friend, beloved, and support in the lives of other people. I love that quote, and I love her, of course. So when grasping arises, we can just use it as an opportunity to look inward rather than grasping in our relationships and our careers or otherwise. Okay? Instead of grasping, try this practice. Meditation teacher Sharon Salzberg says that this is how we can achieve a state of openness. She says, rather than obsessively following states of mind such as anger, fear, or grasping, states that will bring harm to ourselves and others, we can let go as if dropping a burden. And contemplative practices like centering prayer can usher us through the process of letting go. And so that's my challenge. That's my challenge for y'all today. Notice when you're grasping and just drop it. Just let go. Release and allow yourself to exist in the open space. Okay? Thank y'all so much for journeying with me through this piece that's very, very close to my heart, very near to my heart. Told y'all it took me a long time to produce, but I think that it is really relevant, especially this day and age where relationship guidance just feels like not existing, or can feel like it's either at one polar opposite end or the other. So my challenge to you is just to allow yourself to exist in that open space. Allow yourself to exist in the middle, palms open. Peace and blessings to y'all.